Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a whole set of materials, articles, notes, research, all looking at President Biden's year in 2023.
That's right. And this collection, it really gives us a window into the White House operations, some of the president's moments, both public and private, and sketches out key political events from that year.
And our goal here, as always, is to sort through this material together. We want to pull out the most important bits of information, the key insights really, and help you get up to speed fast on what these specific sources are saying about what was a pretty pivotal year.
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's start at the beginning of the year. The sources kick off 2023 talking about a big change right at the top of the White House staff.
They do. It's the handover from Chief of Staff Ron Klain to Jeff Zients. Klain, he's described as someone who just, poured everything into the job. Relentless.
Yeah, the sources paint that picture.
But by late 2022, early 23, they note he was clearly exhausted. There was apparently even a health episode in his office, and he was also dealing with his mother being ill, needing to travel back to Indiana.
Right, a lot going on personally, too.
Exactly. So as he was planning to leave, he was also, according to these sources, very involved in finding who would take over.
And the sources name a few contenders for that. I mean, incredibly tough job.
Yeah, several names pop up. Zients, of course, Steve Ricchetti, Anita Dunn, and also Jennifer Granholm, the energy secretary, though the sources say she took herself out of the running pretty quickly.
Okay, so the sources really get into how Zients and Ricchetti were sized up for the role.
They definitely do. Steve Ricchetti, huge strengths there, deep relationships, tons of experience on Capitol Hill, that's clear.
Right.
But the assessment, at least as presented in these sources, was that the chief of staff job needed someone who could really triage problems across the whole administration, hold people accountable, drive outcomes forcefully.
That kind of operational focus.
Precisely. And the view presented is that Ricchetti, while super loyal and with that long Biden relationship, might have been seen as, well, maybe a bit too close to deliver the really tough messages the job needs sometimes.
Interesting.
And Ron Klain himself, despite his own close bond with Biden, reportedly felt Zients was just a better match for the core management, the implementation side, that Klain thought the job demanded at that specific moment.
It's notable that Zients is described here as being seen more as an Obama guy, maybe not having that same decades-long closeness Klain or Ricchetti had with Biden. But there's a really fascinating bit from Zients' interview process mentioned.
Oh, yeah, that's striking. Even though nothing was public yet, Biden apparently told Zients right there in the interview for the chief of staff job that he was running for re-election.
Wow. Okay. That's dropping a pretty big piece of news in a job interview. How do the sources describe Zients himself? What's his style?
He comes across as very analytical, someone who really likes to dig in, intense discussions, pressure testing decisions. The sources even say he would have preferred to debate the pros and cons of taking the job much more. But, by the time he accepted, the decision was pretty much baked.
And this question of whether running was the right move, it wasn't just debated in that chief of staff search, right? The sources say there were private questions inside the White House, too.
Absolutely. Anita Dunn, another top aide, is described as privately asking others in the White House, sort of, are we sure this is a good idea?
Okay.
Now, the sources say her concern wasn't about his ability to actually do the job of president, his cognitive ability for that. It was more about performing as a candidate on the campaign trail, that grind. She reportedly just really didn't want him to be embarrassed out there.
And the sources add that while some staff inside the White House were maybe wondering about having a meeting to discuss these kinds of things, those conversations were reportedly shut down.
Yeah, shut down by Mike Donnellan and Anthony Bernal, who the sources describe as having the closest access to the president and the first lady. That's the picture these materials paint.
Okay, so shifting from those internal changes, the sources also point to some really big public moments early in 2023 that were designed, it seems, to project strength.
Yeah, they talk about a period where Biden himself reportedly felt pretty confident, maybe even a sense of exuberance, like he was necessary for the country right then.
You can see that reflected in things like that bipartisan infrastructure event in January where he was with Mitch McConnell.
Right. That event for the Brent Spence Bridge grant, it was held up as proof they could still work together on big things, sending a message, that progress was still possible even with all the political division.
But the sources flag another moment as particularly significant and pretty daring. The trip to Kyiv in February. right around the anniversary of the invasion.
Oh, that was huge. A major operation. The sources go into incredible detail about the secrecy, the logistics, a VIP plane, Jake Sullivan getting off in Poland as a decoy while Biden slipped out the back, and then this 10-hour overnight train ride straight into an active war zone.
And the sources really lay out the Secret Service's concerns about this. They weren't minor.
No, not at all. They highlight the big difference. No U.S. air control over Kyiv, unlike presidential trips to, say, Iraq or Afghanistan. And there was this specific worry about a 4-hour stretch on the train where, if something went wrong, the escape plan was basically on foot.
Wow. On foot.
Yeah, and the sources note that's an extra challenge for an 80-year-old man with a noticeably stiff gait.
But Biden was apparently set on going.
Determined. The sources mention him bringing up Nancy Pelosi's trip there earlier, and you can't deny the visual impact standing there with Zelensky while the air raid sirens are going off, saying Putin's war was failing. Powerful stuff.
The sources really frame this trip as a showcase of stamina, of grit.
They do. They link it to Biden's reported belief in his own unique readiness for moments like that, drawing on all his years chairing Senate Foreign Relations. And Jill Biden's quote to CNN right after the trip, look at the man, look what he's doing, that was clearly meant to reinforce that image.
But what's really interesting is how the sources look back on this Kyiv trip now.
Yeah, retrospectively, they describe it as a kind of peak, a high point in terms of his projected physical ability and energy. The sources then argue that, in their view, those abilities started to decline noticeably after this trip and at a faster pace than in his first couple of years in office.
And just briefly on the official health reports, the sources mentioned the February 2023 medical exam from Dr. O'Connor.
Right. The public report noted his gait was stiff but hadn't worsened since the last exam, though the sources add that some aides privately felt his walk did look worse. And importantly, the doctor didn't perform a cognitive exam as part of that checkup.
Okay, so this leads us into the growing concerns behind the scenes that the sources detail, which often stand in pretty stark contrast to some of those public displays of strength.
Exactly. Take Antony Blinken. Knew Biden for ages. He's quoted in the sources saying he had zero concerns about Biden's ability to actually do the job of president in early 2023.
Okay.
However, he apparently expressed real worry about what he called the exponential aging effect of the presidency. How the job just wears people down. And Biden was already 80, only halfway through the term.
And Blinken reportedly took this concern directly to the president.
The sources say he did. He apparently asked Biden if he really wanted to take on the re-election fight, thinking not just about how he felt right then, but the demands for even 6 years down the road.
And Biden's response, according to these sources.
Reportedly, Biden pointed to his confidence, based on his legislative wins, the midterms going better than expected, and, his core belief that he was the only one who'd actually beaten Donald Trump.
But the sources then present this very different picture behind closed doors.
Yeah, they describe these moments away from the cameras, away from the crowds, where Biden apparently seemed completely out of it, spent, exhausted, almost gone.
And this brings us back to observations like Anita Dunn's private questions. Are we sure this is a good idea? Worrying specifically about him as a candidate.
Right, that worry about his ability to handle the campaign grind, the potential for embarrassment. And again, the sources reiterate that any internal staff discussions about maybe raising these concerns directly were apparently shut down by Donilon and Bernal.
The sources also give us these really detailed observations from people traveling with him, specific anecdotes that, for some witnesses, painted a pretty worrying picture. The trip to Ireland in April 2023 is a key example here.
Yeah, initially, that trip sounds like it went incredibly well. Biden was reportedly in fantastic spirits, totally energized by these huge crowds, gave a big primetime speech. There are these really emotional moments, too, seeing the plaque for his son, Beau, meeting the priest who gave Beau last rites.
Very powerful personal moments for him.
Definitely. But then the sources recount this specific incident in Dublin that really stood out to some observers.
What happened?
They were in a private room, just a few people there. Congressman Mike Quigley and Brian Higgins were among them. And Hunter Biden apparently started urging his father to go rest, take a nap.
Really? In front of congressmen?
Apparently so. The sources quote Hunter saying things like, "You promised you wouldn't do this," and you can't handle all this. Biden apparently just sort of waved him off. But the sources note that in that moment, away from the public energy, he seemed utterly sapped and not quite there while he was just getting himself a soft drink.
And Congressman Quigley had a strong reaction to seeing that.
He did. The sources say Quigley suddenly realized Biden in that moment reminded him of his own father before he passed away from Parkinson's. He made this comparison, you know how his dad would get this adrenaline boost from family events, from crowds, but then afterward he'd just deflate, like all the air leaving a balloon. Quigley reportedly felt Biden desperately needed sleep, noting how his energy just seemed gone, his speech breathless, soft, weak.
And Congressman Brian Higgins apparently felt something similar.
Yeah, Higgins's father had Alzheimer's, and he reportedly saw something familiar in Biden's shuffling walk. He used the phrase pattern recognition, like how seeing those physical signs can suggest neurological things.
So they were noticing these things.
He and Quigley were apparently talking quietly about their concerns. Higgins reportedly felt potential cognitive decline was becoming evident to most people that watched him. And the sources note they were also aware of Biden's medical history, the stutter, the 2 brain aneurysms years ago.
It wasn't just politicians noticing things like this, though. The sources include accounts from donors, especially after the re-election campaign kicked off in April.
Yeah, donors who saw Biden up close reportedly noticed big changes from, say, 2019 or 2020. They felt, and this is a direct quote in the sources, that Biden was no longer Biden.
That's a stark assessment.
It is. They described seeing atypical eye movements, finding the small talk kind of stilted, and noticing aides like Annie Tomasini and Ashley Williams needing to guide his nips much more than before.
You give us some specific examples the sources mention.
Little things like maybe stopping mid-speech to go shake hands, then trying to pick back up, or that June 20th fundraiser out in California with Governor Gavin Newsom. That's where Biden made the comment calling Xi Jinping a dictator.
Right, that caused a diplomatic headache.
Big time. Reportedly undermined Secretary Blinken's trip completely. Attendees also described Biden's remarks that night as meandering, especially in contrast to Newsom's presentation.
And the sources quote, an attendee's gut reaction leaving that fundraiser.
Yeah. I remember leaving that fundraiser thinking, fuck, and then realizing he'd kind of become desensitized to how bad it had gotten over time.
So, based on the sources, how did the campaign or the White House adjust when these kinds of observations were happening at fundraisers?
Well, by late 2023, the sources detail a real shift. Fundraisers apparently became much more scripted, much more controlled.
How so?
Open Q&A sessions reportedly became rare. If there were questions, they were often provided ahead of time. They tried to avoid scheduling late events or cramming too many events in after travel. And the photo lines, which used to be Biden chatting everyone up, going way over time.
Yeah, politicians love working a rope line.
Exactly. But those reportedly became hyper-controlled. Very limited photos, move people through fast, keep it quick.
There's another specific anecdote from an August fundraiser, too.
Right. A former longtime aide who was actually working the event reportedly went up to Biden, and the president didn't recognize them at all until another aide quickly stepped in and prompted him.
Oof. And the sources try to explain why these donors and others who saw these moments often kept quiet publicly.
Yeah, it's described as this tortured calculus. Basically, according to the sources, they didn't want to mess with the fact that he was running. They didn't want to end up on the outside if he won. They felt like nobody in charge really wanted to hear their concerns anyway. And there was a real perceived risk, Speak up and you might get your head chopped off politically.
Okay, so beyond these observations, there were also physical incidents that seemed to trigger more direct changes.
The big one detailed is that trip at the Air Force Academy in June 2023, when he tripped over a sandbag on stage.
Right, that got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
What was the internal reaction described in the sources?
Panic. Pure panic, basically. The sources say, given how worried voters already were about his age, that public fall caused huge alarm inside the White House and the campaign.
So what specific changes came out of that, according to these sources?
They list several new protocols, all aimed at preventing more falls. Staff started mapping out shorter walking routes for him. They insisted on using handrails on any steps. They started giving more detailed visual briefings beforehand, like, here's the podium, here are the steps.
Even his clothes or shoes changed.
Yeah, the sources note he started wearing tennis shoes much more often, including specific brands like HOKAs, and reportedly he started using the shorter stairs on Air Force One more consistently after some earlier stumbles on the main stairs.
And this pressure apparently extended to speechwriting, too.
Seems so. The sources describe speechwriters feeling pressure to make remarks shorter, cut down the time he had to stand, sometimes even just scrapping planned speeches entirely. For a while, those monthly remarks on the jobs report were apparently just replaced with written statements.
And cognitive aids became more important.
Yeah, things like teleprompters, note cards described as becoming lifelines. There's an observation that when he did go off script, try to ad-lib, it sometimes looked like it took him a noticeable moment to really gather his thoughts.
But he didn't always like relying on those aides.
No, the sources also say he reportedly resisted sometimes, bristled at needing them, felt like he shouldn't have to rely on them.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the campaign itself in 2023. The sources talk about some struggles there too, particularly with the structure and, well, the candidates' communication.
Right. They describe issues with how the campaign was set up. Julie Chavez Rodriguez had the title campaign manager, but the sources say it was largely honorary. The real power apparently sat with a small group of senior aides, like a Politburo, which led to slow decisions, everything done by committee.
Which made 2023 kind of a stagnant year for the campaign in some ways, according to the sources.
Yeah, despite raising good money and running ads, hiring was apparently slow. The internal culture is described as fractious.
And then there were the reported challenges with the candidate himself, just doing basic communication things like taping videos.
The sources are pretty blunt here. They state that Biden reportedly had real trouble taping even simple, mundane videos without flubbing lines.
How did the team handle that?
They developed workarounds, subtle techniques. If someone asked for a 5-minute video, the response might be, okay, we can do 1 or 2 minutes, knowing even that would be tough.
Wow.
And even then, he often couldn't get through cleanly. So standard practice became filming with 2 cameras instead of just 1. That way they could edit more easily, use jump cuts to cover the mistakes.
So the raw footage, based on these sources, sounds like it was often difficult.
Very. Much of it was reportedly just unusable. One person involved is quoted saying flat out, the man could not speak. And they clarified, this wasn't his stutter. It was struggling to find words, losing his train of thought, forgetting the point.
That sounds incredibly challenging for the production team.
They reportedly even tried things like slow motion editing to make his walk look smoother in videos. Every single video shoot apparently caused anxiety, requiring hours and hours of editing if he was having an off day.
And sometimes the videos just didn't get released at all.
Exactly. If the footage was unsalvageable, it was just shelved. And sometimes even videos that were heavily edited and released were later regretted by some involved.
The sources give an example from even later, April 2024, showing this was an ongoing issue.
Yeah, they described this staged town hall set up specifically to film a campaign commercial. It was in a high school gym, closed to reporters, questions prepared and given to the campaign beforehand. Super controlled environment.
Okay.
90 minutes of filming. And even then, the campaign ultimately decided the footage just wasn't usable, which reportedly led to this internal debate. Was it the advance team's fault, or was it Biden himself?
And the sources also point to a noticeable change in Biden's public schedule, especially after he officially announced he was running again in late April 2023.
Yes, they describe his public schedule becoming increasingly limited. A very clear pattern emerged, according to the sources. Events mostly happened on weekdays, and typically between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m.
They give some numbers for the period before he announced January to April.
Right. Very few events before 10 in the morning. 12 full weekends with 0 public events. And only 12 public events held after 6 p.m., and most of those were off-camera anyway.
And one quote from the sources sums up this observation pretty bluntly.
Yeah. The White House is basically hiding Biden as he auditions for another term.
How did the White House push back against that kind of reporting?
Well, Jen O'Malley Dillon's response to that specific report was just one word: false. The sources note the press team publicly attacked the reporter, calling him a peddler of fake news.
Standard pushback, maybe?
Denying damaging stories is common, sure, but the sources observe that a lot of reporters seem to take these denials at face value initially. Not many outlets outside of conservative media really dug into it at first.
The New York Times did follow up later, in June.
They did. Their report compared Biden's schedule, specifically evening events, unfavorably to President Obama's, noting Obama was reportedly twice as likely to do public events after 6 p.m.
And what was the White House counterargument then?
The sources say they often pointed to Donald Trump's behavior and schedule. But the view presented in the sources is that, what Trump did or didn't do didn't really lessen the scrutiny Biden deserved, especially as the sitting president facing questions about his schedule and communication.
How did aides react internally to all this, the scheduling limits, the observations?
The sources describe a mix. Some were reportedly still in denial. Others had kind of made peace with it.
Made peace how?
The thinking reportedly was the main goal was just beating Trump. He just had to win, and then he could disappear for 4 years. He'd only have to show proof of life every once in a while. The idea seemed to be that the staff could handle the day-to-day, that voters were really voting for the whole team around him. Okay, now running alongside all of this in 2023, there was this other major challenge brewing behind the scenes. The investigation into how President Biden handled classified documents.
Right, the sources call the appointment of special counsel Robert Hur a Chekhov's gun set up in 2023, but the real impact hits later.
Exactly. And the investigation itself, as laid out in the sources, actually started with a discovery back on November 2nd, 2022, just before the midterms.
What was found?
Biden's personal lawyer, Patrick Moore, found classified documents stored improperly in boxes from Biden's time after the vice presidency.
And this was obviously super sensitive timing, with classified documents already being a huge political football.
Huge. The sources really emphasized the timing and how aware everyone was because of the whole Trump Mar-a-Lago situation, the raid that had happened just a few months before in August 22.
So what happened once Moore found these documents?
He immediately told Bob Bauer, who then contacted the White House counsel's office, Stuart Dillery and Richard Sauber, and they, in turn, notified the National Archives General Counsel that same night.
And the archives came in the next day. What did they find?
The sources say the archivists looked through 3 boxes and found 9 classified documents. Some marked top secret, some SCI, that's sensitive compartmented information, about 44 pages in total.
The public didn't know yet, but the FBI got involved pretty fast.
Right away. The formal FBI investigation started November 9th, 2022, the day after the midterms. The sources mention the DOJ warned Bauer about the potential national security risks of having classified stuff sitting unsecured for so long.
The sources also briefly touch on the contrast with Trump's situation.
Yeah, they point out Trump's case involved things like that audio recording where he seemed to be showing off classified material, his alleged refusal to return documents, evidence of potential obstruction. This was all happening while Biden was making public comments, like in that 60 Minutes interview, calling Trump irresponsible.
What was Attorney General Merrick Garland's approach through all this, according to the sources?
He's portrayed as trying really hard to be fair, navigating these super politically charged investigations, including ones involving Hunter Biden. His focus, reportedly, was loyalty to the law, the Constitution, maintaining public trust in the DOJ.
Which led to appointing Jack Smith for the Trump investigations.
Exactly. Once Trump declared he was running again, Garland appointed Smith as special counsel to handle those cases, specifically to avoid the appearance of a political conflict of interest.
And how did the Biden team start to feel about Garland's handling of their own situation?
Well, according to the sources, their view shifted. Some reportedly came to see Garland of constantly trying to appease right-wing critics, and in doing so, actually hurting the president. There was apparently some buyer's remorse among Biden aides, wishing they'd push for someone else's AG. On the flip side, the sources suggest Garland's team felt the Biden folks were in denial and that the problem stemmed from, quote, sloppiness and lack of discipline by the president and his son in handling these sensitive things.
And the search for documents didn't end with that first discovery.
No, not at all. Bauer and Moore reportedly got worried about the garage at Biden's home in Delaware, specifically near where he kept his Corvette.
And they found more there.
They did. A binder with classified markings and an unsealed box with classified documents from 2009 about Afghanistan policy.
So at that point, they brought in the FBI.
Yeah, realizing, okay, we're finding more stuff. They stopped their own search and called the FBI to handle the garage, and other searches turned up more too.
Like in the basement den.
Right. January 11th, 2023. Bauer and another lawyer, Jennifer Miller, reportedly found documents inside a notebook labeled 1612#2 Foreign Policy. When the FBI collected that notebook, they found 2 classified documents tucked inside, one on Afghanistan, one on Iraq.
And it was right after these finds became public that Robert Hur was appointed special counsel.
That's right. The sources paint her as having this really solid public service background, U.S. attorney, high-level DOJ roles before becoming a partner at a big law firm. He's described as, son of Korean War refugees, strong work ethic, deep sense of duty.
He gets a call in January 2023 about taking on a role.
Yeah, Marshall Miller from the DOJ calls, feeling him out about being special counsel. Hur apparently asked for details, but Miller was deliberately vague, just saying it involved a senior government official.
So Hur took the weekend to think it over.
He did. Talked with his wife. The sources say they figured it must be something relatively minor, maybe involving some undersecretary, not a huge deal.
But he said yes.
Ultimately, yes. The sources say it was driven by this sense of patriotic duty, obligation to the DOJ. He'd worked on tough political cases before under Wray at the FBI as Rosenstein's deputy during the Mueller probe. He felt he had to do it.
And taking the job meant a big career change.
Huge. The DOJ made him resign from his lucrative law firm job unless he got this basically impossible waiver from every single client who had any business before the DOJ. Sources quote colleagues reacting really negatively, telling him it was the completely wrong decision, urging him to back out.
But he didn't. And Garland officially appointed him special counsel on January 12, 2023.
Correct.
Okay, so the investigation itself in 2023, the sources describe it as this long, intense grind.
It really was. Her and his team, 7 other lawyers, paralegals, and administrator reportedly worked crazy long hours, just meticulously going through everything, emphasizing fairness, thoroughness.
And a really key witness turned out to be Mark Swanitzer.
Right, Swanitzer. He'd worked with Biden on his memoir, Promise Me, Dad, and as part of that, he'd recorded hours and hours of interviews with Biden after he left the vice presidency, mostly late 2014 to early 2016 timeframe.
And he gave these recordings and transcripts to Her's team.
He provided transcripts and audio files, yeah. But the team noticed some audio files were missing, even though they had transcripts for them.
Why were they missing?
Swanitzer's lawyers apparently told investigators he'd deleted some files after the special counsel was appointed, worried they might get hacked.
But the FBI managed to recover files anyway.
They did. FBI tech experts recovered a bunch of files from Swanitzer's devices. Her's team then took these recovered audio files into their SCI, the secure room to listen.
And this is where the sources describe a major turning point in the investigation. What was on the very first tape Her listened to from that recovered batch.
This is absolutely crucial, according to the sources. It's Biden talking to Swanitzer and his sister Val. They're in McLean, Virginia. The key thing is the timing. This is 2017, well after he's left office. And on the tape, Biden says, quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs."
Wow, I just found all the classified stuff downstairs. What did Her make of that one sentence?
According to the sources, Her saw it as a clear, unambiguous acknowledgement from Biden himself, that he knew he had classified materials while he was a private citizen. It wasn't just stumbling upon them. It seemed like awareness of possession after leaving office and talking about it.
The sources use an analogy to explain just how significant this tape was.
Yeah, like the New York Times election needle. The sources say before hearing this specific tape, just based on the documents themselves, a prosecutor probably wouldn't have brought charges. Low probability. But after hearing Biden say that line, the sources report that needle shot in the other direction. Suddenly, the odds of charges being considered went way, way up.
What else did those recovered tapes reveal as Her's team listened through them?
Well, the sources say they repeatedly heard Biden referring to classified materials, seemingly discussing them or sharing them with Swanitzer, his ghostwriter. But maybe even more importantly, the tapes offered this snapshot of Biden himself back in 2017.
And what did they reveal about that, according to the sources?
They describe Biden on those 2017 tapes as sounding very old and quite diminished, apparently grasping for memories, sometimes having trouble speaking clearly, frequently losing his train of thought during the conversations.
Okay, so how did that observation affect Her and his team's thinking about actually bringing a case to trial?
This became a really critical factor. The sources detail how Her and his team had to game out how a jury might see this man years later, maybe in 2025 or 2026. Given how Biden sounded on those tapes from 2017, the sources say they concluded it would be incredibly hard to convince a jury unanimously that he had the specific intent, the mens rea, required. Could they prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew what he was doing was illegal and intended to break the law, especially considering his apparent cognitive state back then as captured on tape?
And the sources say Her encouraged debate within his team on this very point.
Yeah, make sure they really hashed out the evidence regarding intent. It was central to their whole process.
Okay, another major event in 2023 that the sources say top aide saw as a real inflection point was everything surrounding Hunter Biden.
Yes, according to these sources, key aides pointed to Hunter's plea deal spectacularly collapsing in court in July 2023, and the sudden real fear that he might actually go to prison. They saw that moment as accelerating the president's decline, drawing a parallel to how he was in the months after Beau died.
The plea deal itself had been reached back in June.
June 20th, yeah. Hunter agreed to plead guilty to 2 tax misdemeanors, enter a diversion program for a gun charge. Seemed settled.
But it immediately came under fire.
Oh, yeah. Republicans in Congress, IRS whistleblowers, they went public immediately, calling it a slap on the wrist, claiming the investigation had been interfered with.
And the judge handling the case, Mary Ellen Noreika, she wasn't just going to rubber stamp it.
Not at all. Judge Noreika, a Trump appointee, made that clear in the July hearing. As she started questioning the details, the sources described this courtroom scene where the prosecutors, David Weiss's team, and Hunter's lawyers started pointing fingers at each other over how the deal was structured.
There's a pretty dramatic moment described in the sources.
Yeah, Hunter's lawyer at the time, Chris Clark, reportedly got frustrated and basically told Weiss's team, just rip it up. The defense apparently felt Weiss was changing the terms because of all the Republican political pressure. Hunter himself was reportedly furious. He thought the hearing would just be a formality.
The sources note, Hunter seemed almost more comfortable with the political fight than the legal one.
Yeah, and they mention his dubious distinction of being a central figure in impeachment inquiries against two different presidents.
So after the deal fell apart on July 26, Hunter changed his legal team.
Right. He reportedly brought in Abby Lowell, who the sources describe as a more combative, high-profile lawyer, replacing Chris Clark.
And then David Weiss made a move that complicated things even more for the White House.
Weiss asked A.G. Garland to appoint him as special counsel for the Hunter Biden investigation. Garland agreed, did it on August 11th. So suddenly, as the sources describe Biden aides reacting with fury and cursing Garland, you had two special counsels investigating the president or his immediate family.
How did the president and the family react to this turn of events, according to the sources?
The sources describe them going into panic mode. Hunter was now facing actual trials, potential prison. Someone close to the family is quoted saying Hunter's reaction wasn't really to face it head on, but, as described in the sources, to talk about how opponents were after him, how it was all of a grand conspiracy. He was apparently angry the White House wasn't protecting him more.
And the sources quote Hunter's view on why he was being targeted.
He would reportedly say things like, "They're trying to kill me, they're pushing me to relapse, knowing it will inflict devastating pain on my father." He apparently saw it all as ultimately aimed at hurting his dad.
And the personal toll on the president.
The sources say it deeply wore on the president's soul, that he lived in constant fear that he would lose a third child, referencing, of course, losing Beau to cancer and his infant daughter Naomi in the car accident decades earlier. The sources also connect this to another family issue that became public in July 2023, the acknowledgement of Hunter's daughter, Navy Joan Roberts, who was born out of wedlock.
How did that finally happen, according to these sources?
They say the president was essentially shamed into action by a Maureen Dowd column in the New York Times that really called out the family's public silence about Navy.
Even though a DNA test back in 2019 confirmed Hunter was the father, he apparently continued to resist acknowledging her.
Yeah, the sources say he told people the DNA test might have been tampered with. In his own memoir, he said he didn't even remember the encounter with Navy's mother. He also reportedly tried to stop Navy from using the Biden name and claimed he couldn't afford child support, even while his art was selling for large sums.
And the sources explain why they see this as relevant to the bigger picture they're painting.
They suggest it points to this pattern within the family dynamics, a kind of rejection of reality. And they note this dynamic was sometimes influenced by Hunter's judgment, which they describe as, well, hardly solid.
And Hunter had reportedly told his parents not to acknowledge Navy.
That's what the sources report. And you saw the public reflections of that she wasn't mentioned in the First Lady's 2020 book dedication that named 6 other grandkids, wasn't included in the Christmas stockings hung at the White House in 21 or 22.
Okay, let's go back to the special counsel investigation into the documents. By the fall of 2023, Robert Hur's team reportedly decided they absolutely needed to interview President Biden himself.
Yeah, based on everything they'd gathered, especially those Zoo Monster tapes where Biden seemed to acknowledge having classified material as a private citizen, the sources say it was clear. There was significant evidence suggesting he might have willfully and knowingly kept classified documents and notes, which were then stored recklessly. An interview was necessary.
What were the logistics? How did they arrange the interview, according to the sources?
There was some back and forth between Hur's team and the White House lawyers. The WH lawyers apparently pushed back against videotaping, but agreed to an audio recording. They settled on 5 hours total, split over 2 days. Hur's team was open on location, but the White House invited them to conduct the interview right there.
And the first day was October 8th, 2023.
Which the sources really emphasize the timing here, was the day after the horrific Hamas attack on Israel. Biden was reportedly incredibly upset about events unfolding, but the message came back he still wanted to go ahead with the interview as planned.
Where did it happen? Who was there?
Started in the China room, then moved to the map room. You had Her's team, President Biden, White House counsel Ed Siskel, and Biden's personal lawyers all in the room.
How did it start off?
Her reportedly began by acknowledging the awful news from Israel, thanked Biden for proceeding and cooperating. Biden mentioned he'd just spoken with Netanyahu. Then he apparently made a joke about the FBI agents in the room already knowing his house better than he did. Got some laughs.
But then the sources describe some pretty alarming observations made by her and his team during the interview itself.
Yeah, they report that Biden's voice was often so soft, the FBI agents had to keep moving the microphones closer just to pick him up.
Yeah.
And he reportedly just seemed, well, every bit of his 81 years.
Can you give some specific examples from the sources of moments that raised concern during that interview?
They detail points where Biden reportedly forgot words, just trailed off mid-sentence. His answers apparently jumped between topics unpredictably. He'd tell these long, rambling stories that would just end abruptly, often using phrases like anyway or all kidding aside when he seemed to, lose the thread.
There was an exchange about searching his house.
Right. Biden apparently joked about the FBI finding risque pictures of his wife. Then he started describing his library, the filing cabinets, a copy machine, but he reportedly blanked on the word fax machine. The sources note White House counsel Ed Siskel apparently had to supply the term. Then Biden reportedly went off on this tangent about giving great eulogies.
And later, talking about furniture, like a drafting board he had because he was a frustrated architect, he struggled with another word.
Yeah, describing photos on display, he apparently couldn't think of the word for the board they were on. Siskel reportedly jumped in with poster board.
When Herr showed him pictures of his Delaware house, Biden reportedly got sidetracked again.
Started talking about things completely unrelated to the documents at the walnut tree outside, the guy who built a room, how much that room cost, saying it was 1/3 of the entirety of my entire home. Just off topic.
And when Herr tried to steer him back to the specific drawers where classified stuff was found.
Biden reportedly described the drawers, but then again mentioned the printer and the fax machine. The sources note Siskel had to supply fax machine again, this time described as doing it wearily.
Okay, but a really critical exchange described in the sources happened when Herr asked about the time he lived in McLean, Virginia, around 2017.
Yeah, this was super important because of the Zwanitzer tapes referencing classified material found downstairs during that period. Biden reportedly got the time wherein confused, asking, this is what, 2017, 2018, that area? Then he apparently connected that period to his son Beau's deployment or death, saying, my son is either been deployed or is dying. But the sources stress this was factually wrong. Beau was deployed way back in 2008, 2009, and tragically died in May 2015, not 2017 or 2018.
He reportedly seemed unsure about the timing of Beau's death, too, and even when Trump was elected.
Yeah, the sources report him asking, was it 2015 he had died? And then asking if Trump was elected in November of 2017 before someone reminded him it was 2016.
And then, unprompted by Herr's question about McLean, he reportedly just launched into this long tangent.
The sources say Biden went on for 6 minutes talking about Beau, their relationship, taking the train home together, Beau living nearby, a promise Beau made, the Charlottesville rally, a family meeting. None of it related to the original question about where he was living in 2017.
What was Herr's reaction to this during the interview, according to the sources?
The sources describe Herr becoming concerned. He felt the president seemed confused, had landed on this really emotional topic, and Herr reportedly felt bad for him, felt sympathy. He actually suggested taking a break.
But Biden refused.
Yeah, reportedly said, let me just keep going to get it done. And the sources note that Herr and his team reflected on this later. How would a jury react to testimony like that? They apparently felt many jurors might just be overcome with sympathy for the president, making them reluctant to convict regardless of the evidence.
Okay, so by the fall of 2023, the sources indicate that these kinds of concerns about President Biden weren't just inside the White House or from investigators. They were apparently mounting among influential Democrats outside that immediate circle, too.
Right. The sources bring in Ari Emanuel, CEO of Endeavor, big Democratic donor. He was reportedly watching what he saw as Biden's deterioration and sensing this deep denial among many Democrats.
What did Emanuel do about it, according to the sources?
He apparently started making calls, calling governors, encouraging them to think about running, talked to his brother, Rahm Emanuel, discussed his worries with other powerful people.
And this reportedly boiled over into a very public confrontation at Emanuel's own retreat the weekend in late September 2023.
Yeah, during a panel discussion featuring Ron Klain, Emanuel reportedly just started yelling at Klain from the back of the room, saying things like, Biden cannot run, he needs to drop out, he can't win, demanding to know what's plan B.
Wow, publicly yelling at the former chief of staff.
Yeah.
How did Klain respond?
According to the sources, Klain was firm. No plan B, said Biden's the sitting president, he's the only one who beat Trump. End of story.
And Emmanuel's reaction to that?
Incensed, apparently. Reportedly shot back, what the fuck are we doing? He argued the first party to put up a younger candidate would probably win if they had time to build support. He cited his own experience knowing Trump well from being his agent back in the day. Attendees apparently described it as a wild, public yelling match.
Emmanuel reportedly came away believing Biden's inner circle was just lying about his condition.
Yeah, he reportedly felt like, we're seeing it. It's called age. It happens. The sources quote him blaming Jill Biden, Hunter, Jeffrey Katzenberg, Klain, even Biden himself for not being the bridge he promised. He felt nobody was being honest with Biden, telling him he just wasn't capable of running.
And he refused to donate.
Apparently, Katzenberg called him asking for donations, and Emanuel refused. Reportedly wanted nothing to do with the campaign.
Bill Daley, former Obama chief of staff, Clinton Commerce Secretary, the sources detail his concerns, too.
Daley knew Biden for 40 years. He reportedly started watching him on TV back in 2022 and just got this sinking feeling, was reportedly stunned by the deterioration, told friends he hardly recognized the man, felt like the situation was going to work.
And in 2023, Daley apparently started making calls, trying to see if anyone would primary Biden.
Yeah, he reportedly felt Biden just wasn't up for a general election campaign. And he worried that if they waited, the party would be stuck with Vice President Harris, who wasn't polling as well. So he apparently reached out to governors like Newsom, Beshear, Pritzker, testing the waters.
So they all said no.
Declined, yeah. The sources say they were basically told, if you challenge Biden and then he loses, you'll be a pariah. You'll get blamed for the loss.
The sources describe other disquieting experiences from senior Democrats around that same time, fall 2023.
Right, like Jamie Harrison, the DNC chair, reportedly had this encounter at a Congressional Black Caucus event. Biden shook his hand, didn't say anything, seemed not to recognize him at all. Harrison apparently later confided to another Democrat, that wasn't good, right?
Senator Mark Warner, who chairs the Intelligence Committee, reportedly had a phone call with Biden that left him worried, too.
Warner was initially calling about something specific concerns about sending Yemeni detainees from Guantanamo to Oman, worrying they might rejoin terrorist groups. He raised it with Jake Sullivan, who passed it to Biden. But when Biden called Warner back, the senator reportedly felt the president seemed oblivious, just clearly not up to speed, on the specific worries Warner thought were pretty obvious given the intel context. Warner apparently wondered if this lack of grasp was connected to the visible signs of aging he was seeing.
David Axelrod's reaction to those bad poll numbers in early November 2023 is also covered.
Yeah, that New York Times Siena poll showing huge jumps in voters thinking Biden was too old, 34%, up to 71%, and lacking mental sharpness, 45%, up to 62%. Axelrod reportedly hoped maybe this data would finally convince the White House or the family that Biden shouldn't run. The sources list several candidates Axelrod thought could be viable alternatives.
Axelrod also apparently felt the whole Bidenomics campaign push from June 2023 was tone-deaf.
Totally out of touch, he reportedly thought. Like taking a victory lap for an economy people hated. He argued they missed the point. People judge the economy by how they feel their own lives, not by government stats. He felt Biden was coming across as the voice of discredited Washington institutions, making him seem out of touch, which only helped Trump's argument that the world was chaotic and Biden wasn't in control.
And then Axelrod took his concerns public.
He did. Posted on X, linked the poll charts, and asked very directly if Biden running was wise, whether it's in his best interest or the country's.
The reaction from the Biden camp was reportedly immediate and harsh.
Fast and furious, the sources say. Ron Klain publicly dredged up Axelrod's old 2019 Mr. Magoo comment about Biden, and the sources report Biden privately called Axelrod a prick, which then leaked.
But Axelrod heard from others privately.
Yeah, the sources say he got confidential messages from lots of prominent Democrats agreeing with him, but they wouldn't say anything publicly. They were reportedly just resigned to Biden running and didn't want to do anything to weaken him further.
David Morehouse, former political guy associated with the Pittsburgh Penguins, he shared a striking observation from a fundraiser in Philly in December 2023.
Morehouse had campaign experience. He reportedly went to this luncheon, saw Biden up close, and was just stunned by how frail he seemed, said he felt like Biden was nothing but bones.
And Biden told him a story that wasn't true.
Apparently told him a story involving John Kerry that Morehouse knew for a fact didn't happen. Morehouse reportedly got really worried about Biden's eyes, said it reminded him of his own mother's short-term memory problems before she died, being on a loop, repeating things after an hour or so.
So based on all that, Morehouse reached a conclusion.
Yeah, based on his political background and what he saw, he reportedly concluded Biden cannot run for president.
Did he tell anyone?
He reportedly called a governor he was close to right away and Anthony Bernal at the White House, but got little response. Other Clinton-era folks he talked to apparently told him, basically, you can't talk about this stuff, we're supporting Biden. Morehouse reportedly started wondering if Biden's own advisors had a duty to figure out how to get him to step aside, feeling the whole thing was irresponsible.
Congressman Adam Smith had a similar kind of realization at the White House Christmas party in December 2023.
Smith hadn't interacted with Biden a ton before. He reportedly thought previously Biden seemed basically the same as in 2020, maybe long-winded, looked old, but fundamentally okay. But at that Christmas party, he was reportedly stunned, felt Biden seemed completely out of it while mingling, doing the photo line.
And other people at the party noticed, too.
Yeah, shared alarm. They noted the First Lady took the lead during the remarks. Biden stuck really close to a script. Someone reportedly thought, can't even do holiday party remarks. At another party that week, Biden was apparently barely audible, hard to understand even with a mic.
So the overall picture, painted by the sources by the end of 2023,
is that President Biden seemed significantly feebler. A few commentators, like David Ignatius, Bill Maher, started talking about the age issue more openly, but the sources say very few Democrats were willing to voice concerns publicly. Dean Phillips is noted as a rare exception.
Okay, so with these observations starting to surface more, the sources also detail how the White House and the campaign reportedly responded. They call it shooting the messengers.
Yeah, they describe the specific strategy, a modus operandi that developed, actively going after journalists who reported on questions about the president's age and health.
What was the strategy exactly, according to the sources?
It involved getting social media influencers, friendly progressive reporters, Democratic operatives to basically besmirch the journalists asking these questions, paint them as unprofessional, biased, applying double standards compared to Trump.
The sources give a concrete example of this.
Yeah, a text message from a campaign operative, Brooke Gorin, asking Democrats to publicly push back against what seemed like a pretty standard New York Times story by Michael Shear, a veteran reporter, amplifying criticism of the NYT editors for even running it.
The goal seems pretty clear.
According to the sources, yeah, shame journalists. Create a disincentive structure so reporters would hesitate to ask tough questions, undermine the credibility of the reporting itself, argue the whole topic was just illegitimate. The sources mention even more aggressive texts apparently came from comms aides like Andrew Bates at the White House, TJ Ducklow at the campaign, often using encrypted apps.
A Democratic operative is quoted describing how intense this pushback felt.
They describe being pushed repeatedly and insistently to attack outlets and reporters, being told to shame them on social media, point out supposed errors, bias, different standards for Trump, called it a full-blown freakout whenever these stories dropped.
And how did Michael Shear, the reporter who was targeted, see this response?
According to the sources, Shear felt it was clearly intentional. A strategy designed to scare reporters off the topic, undermine media credibility on the issue, and just flat out deny the issue even existed.
There's a pretty telling anecdote in the sources about a White House official's reaction directly to Shear.
Yeah, Shear reports a White House official literally screaming at him on the phone just for mentioning Biden's age in the first paragraph of a short news story about Biden getting COVID, demanding he remove it because it was not relevant.
And Shear sums up the official line he always got when he asked Biden officials about age and health.
The sources give his summary. He's exactly the same person he always was. Age is not an issue. He's incredibly sharp in meetings. There are no accommodations being made for him because of his age.
And the source's final word on those official answers.
They state it very plainly. Those answers were not true. And this effort to kind of manage the public story, as described in the sources, it connects back to that internal scheduling stuff we talked about earlier.
Right, shifting things to that midday window.
Exactly. By late 2023, staff were reportedly trying to cram as much of Biden's schedule as possible into that middle part of the day when they thought he was at his sharpest. This period was apparently known internally as the block.
The sources give an example schedule from late 2023.
Yeah, October 3rd, 2023. It shows morning prep, meetings, then lunch, after lunch, desk time, then POTUS time, from about 2:15 to 4:15 p.m., and dinner often scheduled super early, like 4:30 p.m.
POTUS time sounds a bit vague.
Could be. The sources say it might have been a placeholder for things few people needed details on, or just a way to block out that afternoon chunk. The sources also state that when Biden was in D.C., his workday often wrapped up with him heading back upstairs to the residence around 5:15 p.m., and he rarely came back down after that.
Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We pulled out a lot of significant details from this specific set of sources about President Biden's 2023. Looking at all this material synthesized, what's the main tension or the core insight that really jumps out to you?
What's really striking is the contrast these sources present. You've got, on one side, this clear political imperative, the deep belief that Biden had to be the candidate, that he was the only one who could beat Trump, that conviction.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have these really consistent, very detailed observations from so many different people in so many different settings, public events, private moments, formal interviews, fundraisers, all pointing, according to these sources, to significant physical and cognitive challenges throughout that year.
And the sources also put a lot of focus on the efforts reportedly made to manage those limitations, maybe even obscure them at times.
Absolutely. The scheduling accommodations, the changes to how events were run, the reported heavy reliance on cognitive aids like teleprompters, the reaction to things like the sandbag fall, and that describes strategy of attacking reporters who raise questions. All these actions, as detailed here, really suggest this intense effort to square the political necessity with the private reality that people were apparently observing and dealing with.
So for you listening, the real value here is cutting through all the noise to understand the different perspectives and the specific stories contained within this particular set of source materials. It helps you grasp what's being reported from various angles and how the situation was apparently being seen and managed behind the scenes based only on this information we've discussed, without us taking any side.
And it leaves you with a pretty big question to think about, processing all this. Given what these sources allege about the difficulties of managing the huge demands of the presidency and a campaign alongside reported physical and cognitive challenges, what does that tell us about leadership itself? About the role advisors and family play in these incredibly high-stakes situations? And about the public's right to know? What standards should we as a society even use to judge a candidate's fitness for